Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Janus Academy. This is still our historical analogy series. We are getting to the end of the entire list of chapters that we had in plan, and today we're going to be talking about Romanticism. This is 25th installment and the penultimate one. Now, we've already discussed about Romanticism in several different installments. This one is a bit different. So we started by addressing Paleologian Renaissance and Romanticism. Before that, it was Romanesque art and Neoclassicism. And this was something that dealt more or less strictly with Romanticism as present in visual arts. Now, of course, as we know, Romanticism is a very broad and complex category. It has to do with visual arts as well as it does with literature, as well as it does with music, with philosophy, equally important, if not more so. It's a very complex and broad phenomenon. And it is something that has dealt an indelible influence on culture in general. Now, I want to make a very important distinction that today we're not going to be talking about how Romanticism deals with the Paleologian Renaissance on one end and how it deals with Expressionism on the other. We are going to be talking about it in a more global manner. So when I'm discussing Romanticism now, when we are bringing it up as a topic, we are talking about it as something that is much more deep and much more complex than any of the topics that we've dealt thus far. We are going from a premise that is really important, that Romanticism is basically still happening, that it's still ongoing. I'm going to get back to that a bit later. So what we are trying to understand here is that Romanticism is an incredibly broad category that begins, let's say, in the second half of the 18th century, and that peaks sometimes around half of the 19th century. Now, if you're to go through regular history of art books, or if you're to go through history of literature, or even history of philosophy, history of music, books and encyclopedias, you will get to this point that Romanticism peaks in the second half, that is in the middle of the 19th century, and then it disappears. You can find different interpretations that Romanticism doesn't really disappear, that it still lingers through neo-romantic movement, through various different stylistical formations that are mostly seen as anachronists, which means outside of their own time. And you can basically go all the way up to the 40s of the 20th century, and you can trace these lingering remnants of Romanticism. But then again, this is only if we choose to look at Romanticism as something that deals, again, with visual arts or with literature or with music. And that's not how we're dealing with it. We are dealing with it as a global and more widespread phenomenon. Now, we've already covered this hypothesis to a certain extent, something we're going to go back to time and again. That certain eras and certain stylistical formations are more connected to certain countries than others, or are connected in a more important manner. Now, you could say that Italian Renaissance is more important, more influential, more relevant for history and history of art than, let's say, French Renaissance or Russian Renaissance that happens in a completely different period of time, or German Renaissance. Of course, Italian Renaissance influences German Renaissance directly. You could also say that Gothic style begins in France, and it's more important in France than it is in, let's say, Italy, where it's more or less marginally present, or Germany, where it's less marginally present. And this is to say that certain periods are connected to certain countries, to certain cultures. You could also say that Impressionism, of course, is a very French phenomenon. Now, of course, we have Impressionism in Italy, we have it in the United States of America, we have it in England, but it's nowhere quite as important as in France, where it more or less originated, and so on and so forth. When we are talking about Romanticism in this particular manner, we are talking about the fact that it begins, for most of it, in Germany, and that it, of course, is drastically and massively influenced by the French Revolution, but no one contests that Germany really is the origin of Romanticism. Now, this is, again, if we choose to look at it particularly, and if we choose to focus either on literature or philosophy or visual arts. But we are doing this global overview, and we are going with this idea that Romanticism has spread and that it has installed itself in all of the cultures, well, all of the cultures of the first world, I would add. though it is also present in cultures and countries of the third world in its own way, and that it's still ongoing. And in this particular way, we want to do a different type of analogy. So we're not going to be focusing on one or two stylistical formations as we've done thus far. We're going to bring them all together. So yeah, this is an incredibly ambitious endeavor, and let's hope it ends up making some sort of sense. I'm going to try to break it down a bit. Now, we've done let's say several different things here with this course, and if you followed all of our lectures thus far, you were able to spot a certain cyclical pattern, and this is something that we're going to be addressing in the second part of the conclusion, the 26th and final lecture, that we've presented this cyclical form of history of art, repeating patterns. This is a very important thing, and I've done this very deliberately. So we've talked about Romanticism as it deals with Paleologian Renaissance, the Byzantine era, the Byzantine stylistical formation. And on the other end, we've talked about it as it dealt with Expressionism. So we have this idea that Romanticism was influenced by a previous era, and then it influenced a sequent era. So we've dealt with three eras at the same time. And now what we're trying to do in this particular lecture is that we're trying to bring all of these things together. Now, why am I doing this? Why are we doing this? Well, it has to do with the very nature of Romanticism as such, again, seen in a more global manner. And going after this premise that Romanticism was predicted to last 300 years, which, if you think about it, beginning in the second half of the 18th century, would mean that it's still ongoing. It's alive and well. We are talking about it in this particular manner because one of the main traits of Romanticism, and arguably any period after the fall of the Roman Empire, of the Western Roman Empire, including the medieval period and then Renaissance and everything that comes afterwards, is basically dedicated to one endless recapitulation. Now, we can give ample evidence that this is the case with Renaissance. We could argue that to a certain extent it begins with the Renaissance. We could also argue that it begins with the medieval period. The main point is this: Romanticism deals with recapitulation on one end, so it looks very far into the past, but it also deals with the generation and creation of all these new stylistical formations, and it's incredibly productive in this manner. Now, when people talk about Romanticism ending in the second half of the 19th century, it coincides chronologically very much with the creation of modern art, and with all these different isms that appear instead of Romanticism, which again is another ism. So instead of Romanticism, we start having symbolism, and we start having Impressionism, if we're going to talk about visual arts. And we have many other stylistical formations that last shorter and shorter as we go. You could argue that Impressionism began in the second half of the 19th century and was pretty much over by, let's say, World War II. Give or take, it was over probably even before that. You could argue that Expressionism began more or less at the beginning of the 20th century, and it was pretty much over, I would say, by the 50s. It was already abstract Expressionism, which is a completely different thing. Whereas on the other end, we have periods like the medieval that lasted 1,000 years. We have Renaissance that lasted several centuries. Baroque, a bit shorter than Renaissance, but also a fairly long time as compared to everything that happened afterwards. So we're talking about the fact that Romanticism brings about this whole notion of speeding up, of eras that last shorter and shorter. And of course, this, as is the case with anything else, has a lot to do with the Industrial Revolution. And if you followed our previous lectures, you can pretty much develop that argument, and you can understand how and why that is the case, how and why it happens. The point is this: we want to go back to this premise that Romanticism looks to the past and looks to the future equally. The point is that in Romanticism, seen in this global manner, we can see traces of many previous eras. And we can see these previous eras being projected into the future. We can see this very present tendency that I argue is there pretty much from beginning of time, but that is there nowadays in a more deliberate, more conscientious manner. This idea that we build our future from our past, that we use past as our material, as our building blocks with which we create the future. And nowhere is this more evident than in Romanticism. And this really has a lot to do not only with art and culture, but also very much to do with politics. Now, we said that Romanticism is very connected to the French Revolution, to a certain extent to the American Revolution too. But let's stay with the French because this is a European continental affair, though it had global ramifications and consequences. The thing is that French Revolution sought to bring about this novel idea of republic, of democracy, of doing away with monarchy, of creating a secular society, all of those. But in fact, those ideas were not terribly novel at all, except perhaps the one with the secular society. That one is fairly iffy, I should say. We didn't have that many precedences to that idea. But if we talk about democracy, it already existed, albeit in a very different form. If we talk about the republic, it already existed. We know that Rome was a republic. So was Dubrovnik, so was Venice to a certain extent, so was more or less every city-state in Italy during the medieval and Renaissance periods. So this is not terribly new. I mean, I know that French people like to pretend that they've invented the republic, they've invented democracy. That's not quite the case. Greeks, to a certain extent, invented democracy, and yeah, this is something that already existed, if you will, thousands of years before the French Revolution. But this is exactly the point that we're trying to get to, that French Revolution was a momentous historical event that has influenced so much of the world, but it's basically rehashing of the already existing thing. It's trying to bring back what was already there. And you can say the same thing about Romanticism in all of arts, poetry as well as visual arts, as well as to a certain extent philosophy. I'm going to get back to that in a minute. It's this idea that you look to the past so that you seek for inspiration, you seek your inspiration in the past so that you can build your future. And the French Revolution, I think, is the best example for this, because if you think about symbolical presentation of the French Revolution, if you think about the symbols and sigils that they've adopted, those all mostly came from Rome. They really saw themselves as the new Romans. And this is not a joke. This is not just LARPing or cosplaying. This really was a very serious affair for the French revolutionaries. So they've adopted the Phrygian cap as a symbol. They've adopted all of the other Roman symbols like the fasces. They've adopted pretty much everything they could from Rome. They wanted the institution of the Senate. They really wanted to see themselves as the new Romans. And if you walk through the city of Paris, this is something we talk about on our tours, you can literally see that most of the monuments built during and after the French Revolution were very much inspired by Roman architecture. I mean, one of the most famous monuments in the city of Paris is the Triumphal Arch, and of course we know who made Triumphal Arches. It was the Romans. We can see that the column of Austerlitz that is in Place Vendôme is a very clear copy of column of Trajan that is in the Roman Forum, and we can see that Napoleon presented in these monuments, in these statues, wears a toga. He was very serious about being the new Roman emperor. This is a whole story. We can do not one but more lectures talking about his connection to Charlemagne, talking about his connection to the institution of the Roman Empire, and so on and so forth. If you go to the tomb of Napoleon in Hôtel des Invalides, you can see many reliefs presenting Napoleon passing different laws and important acts where he is depicted in wearing a toga. So again, yes, they were very serious about this Roman business. And to them, it was basically a given. So we have this interesting situation that I say permeates all of Romanticism, that you look to the past and you inspire yourself to build the society of the future. Now, if we're looking at this particular example in arts, in visual arts, or more globally, we are also looking to the fact that we inspire ourselves with times that have already passed. This is a very romantic affair. And you can see this very clearly in the way we've structured our lectures. You can see that a lot of our lectures were dedicated to the medieval period. There is a very strong medieval inspiration present in Romanticism, and we're going to elaborate that in a minute. You could argue that a lot of the lectures we've done were dedicated either to the Gothic style, how it connects to Impressionism, but also how Gothic revival style has to do with Dada, how it has to do with abstract art, how it has to do with Surrealism and abstract Expressionism. Now, you could say that not only these were very explicit comparisons and analogies. You could say that medieval period, I would say medieval rather than Gothic, though it's not entirely the same, but it's approximated, is present in most of the 19th and 20th and indeed 21st century stylistical formations. Of course, we're talking about different aspects of medieval thought. We are talking about either incredible ambition to understand the inner mind of God, to understand the working of the universe from this particular perspective. We're talking about aesthetic impulse, about aesthetical inspiration. We are talking about the special take on reason and fate and how they differ one from another. We're also talking about the carnival as a very important medieval institution. We've covered all of these things in previous lectures. And we have dealt with this idea that truly modern art in its entirety, and I would argue modern as well as contemporary art perhaps even more so than modern art, are profoundly medieval. They have a deeply medieval inspiration. And this too is a trait that comes from Romanticism, because Romanticism was very much invested in the medieval period. And it sought to recreate and to bring back the medieval period. Now, you can argue that this has different reasons and that it's rooted in different affairs. One of the affairs definitely is the idea that after the French Revolution, we have the social class of the bourgeoisie building the new world, building the new society in politics as well as in economy, as well as in arts. And that they seek to define themselves both as the new Romans and as the new medieval people. Now, this is quite curious and quite interesting, because you could argue also that most of the medieval period is basically trying to preserve, conserve, and bring back to a certain extent the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. Broadly speaking, the Roman culture. We could say that the Charlemagne crowns himself as the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, this is not an accident. Of course, he does it very deliberately. And we can say that the Holy Roman Empire then is a very important medieval institution that incidentally lasts all up until Napoleon destroys it. So you can see this bridge between, medieval period and then what comes after it, the definitive destruction of every medieval institution. In this, that is happening in this period that is all about Gothic revival, and it's all about going back to the medieval period. So it's this idea that the bourgeois people have a very strong connection with the medieval period, because it is the period that sees their growing and their importance and their emerging onto the political and cultural scene of Europe. It is truly in the late medieval period that the bourgeois people start gaining a lot of wealth. They start profiling themselves. They start building different institutions, and they're gaining more and more economic and political power. We can see the emergence of guilds as very important, again, social and economic and political institutions. And then we can see that this is really when we start observing changes made into the world, the growing power of the bourgeoisie that culminates with the French Revolution, which is the moment where the bourgeois take over, well, pretty much everything. And if we are thinking about the French Revolution, it is important to understand that the full appellation of this event is the Great French Bourgeois Revolution. And it is by far not this romantic idea that we have of the French Revolution, that it was the poor people rising against the wealthy. Not at all. It was sadly one kind of wealthy people rising against a different kind of wealthy people. So it was really new money against old money, if we are to present it in a simple manner. But we see that it was really all about the bourgeois lifestyle. It was all about the bourgeois worldview. And then we see them trying to bring back the medieval period pretty much while at the same time they're trying to establish or bring back Roman institutions, which I think is really funny, but nonetheless historically relevant and accurate. Now, this is the way in which we can address all of these stylistical formations that we've been dealing with. And this is why this is why we made a choice to start with Romanesque art and not to start with, let's say, a classical Greek period or Hellenism or archaic or pre-archaic art, because, of course, the world did not start with Romanesque era. It goes way back into the past. We could have started with Egypt. We could have started with Sumer. There's a lot to be said about all of these, and we are going to say a lot of these when we start the courses that is dedicated to general history of art. Actually, we're going to go back way before, at the very beginning of history of art, the very beginning of humanity, if you will. So cave art, but not really. We'll get there when we get there. The point I'm trying to make is that there are many different stylistical formations in existence before Romanesque art, but we chose to start with it. And then, of course, the analogy that we've made was Romanesque art to neoclassicism. And by no mistake and by no accidents, neoclassicism is something that happens alongside Romanticism, as we've discussed. And it's also something that happens right around the French Revolution. So this is the stylistical formation that really goes chronologically and to a certain extent thematically right alongside Romanticism. They're both inspired by Greco-Roman culture. They're both looking back into the past. They both seek to bring something from the past so that the future could properly be built. And this is the reason why we were seeking to make this thematically and chronologically coherent. And we were looking into what was important for Romanticism, because truly it's in the very focus of all of these different eras. Now, we've said that Romanticism looks, especially German Romanticism, especially in poetry, it looks a lot towards the classical world. It looks a lot towards Greece and Rome, but I would argue Greece a bit more. And it takes a lot from that context, but again, it also takes a lot from the medieval context. So this is why we chose neoclassicism and Romanesque art. Now, of course, as you saw from that first lecture, there's a lot of similarities, again, by no accident, between Romanesque art and neoclassicism. And everything that happens from then onwards has to do with Romanticism one way or the other. It has to do with Gothic revival, more or less, the neo-medieval mind frame. And of course, it has to do with Romanticism. Now, there's another very important thing to be addressed here, and this is the omission of certain stylistical formation that we have made that some of you that are familiar with history of art must have noticed. So you must have noticed that we didn't cover stylistical formations like futurism, Italian futurism, which is very important. And you must have noticed that we haven't really said that much about Art Deco, be it American or European. And yes, there were many other stylistical formations from later on that we didn't include because of different reasons. First one is that we sought thematical and chronological coherence. And second of all, equally important, I would say, is that we sought to address stylistical formations that are fairly original and unique. Now, why am I saying this? I am saying this that if we are talking about, let's say, Art Deco, it grows out of Art Nouveau and it gives birth to a certain extent to Streamline. But talking about different other stylistical formations, we already cover a lot of Art Deco. So it would be a lot of repetition. And I could say that we omitted futurism, Italian futurism, for same reasons, because it's all about the industrial age and it's all about the industrial revolution and people being fascinated with machines and people being very, well, optimistic about future. It's all very Saint-Simonian. And this is something that we address in different lectures. So while I think that Italian futurism, of course, is more than relevant and has a place in history of art, We've already covered a lot of its traits by talking about other different stylistical formations, so it just felt a bit redundant. But I would just like to say that it does not mean that it's any less important. Again, this was just a choice that had to do with the structure of this particular course, where it was organized in such a way for all of it to make sense and all of it to be curated in a way that speaks about Gothic revival, and I would say again neo-medieval mind frame, neo-medieval inspiration on one end, and then Romanticism on the other, because Gothic revival is in a way a part of Romanticism. Again, Romanticism is a much broader category. And when we are talking about these things, we are truly talking about, again, this premise that Romanticism lasts a very, very long time, or was meant to have lasted a very, very long time. So we are talking about all these different stylistical formations as basically being branches of Romanticism. And this is a really important thing to understand, that we see, and again, this is just the subjective perspective that we assume, we see both Impressionism and Expressionism and Pointillism as branches of Romanticism. Now, again, you could say that Romanticism is in itself but a branch of the Renaissance, and there's enough arguments about this, and you could unravel this all the way into the past, all the way to beginning of the medieval period. And yeah, there's something to be said about it, but you have to draw a line someplace, and we chose to draw it here. So we chose to, well, draw two lines in a way. One was Romanesque art, so that was the first, and the second one was modern art. And then we'll deal with these other eras in some other time. Now, I think that seeing how Romanticism came from Germany, or rather the space we today call Germany, it wasn't called that back in the day, we need to discuss contribution that was made by German philosophers, and it was truly immensely important. Now, when I say German philosophers, of course, there's too many to mention, but we have to really stop on certain names, and we have to make a sort of a recapitulation of why we've dealt with these particular people in this particular manner. Now, you could argue that Fichte was incredibly important for Romanticism, and he was, and there's nothing to be added about this, whereas we didn't really mention Fichte quite as much. You could argue that Kant was very important, though he doesn't really belong to Romanticism. He belongs to the Enlightenment. He is the pinnacle of the Enlightenment. We've spoke a lot about Hamann, rightfully so. He also belongs to the Enlightenment, but really opens up Romanticism, is incredibly important for Romanticism. So we talked about him. And of course, we talked about Nietzsche, and we talked about Heidegger, though he is more of the 20th century phenomenon, but still very much influenced by Romanticism. We spoke briefly, if I'm not mistaken, about Schopenhauer, also a very important influence. We spoke about Hegel, an incredibly important influence. And we have omitted to mention perhaps the most important, next to Hamann, influence of them all, and that is Schlegel. Perhaps we've said a couple of words about him. Schlegel is immensely important. He is easily the greatest influence, the greatest shaper, if you will, of Romanticism and everything that would ensue. Now, he is the person that really substantiates with his work to this position that we are still to this day in the era of Romanticism, that both modern and postmodern eras are indeed but branches of Romanticism. Why do we say this? Well, if we think about modernity and postmodernity, which is the larger part of discourses, we are truly talking about this idea that it's very much invested, both of these eras are invested into recapitulation of the past, yet again, especially if we're talking about postmodernity. Now, these are the things that start in modernity quite heavily, and then they are done more deliberately and with more focus and with more attention in the postmodern period. So much so that one of the main traits of postmodernity really is recapitulation. Playing with references, being all about references, being all about this particular layer of meaning that situates itself above what is said, above the meaning of the word, and all of those other things we've already discussed. And Schlegel really is immensely important because he is the first person to truly address almost all of these things. Now, you could say that Schlegel truly announces the postmodern period to a certain extent, which is fascinating if you think that he acts in the second half of the 18th and the first half of the 19th century. And already we have main premises of postmodern period being established. This makes us think that one of the greatest influences and one of the greatest creators of Romanticism era truly unraveled what postmodernity would be. Now, of course, we also didn't mention a very important influence that I guess kind of comes from the realm of philosophy, but not really. I mean, more from history of ideas, I would say. Literature, for sure. This is Rousseau, and his work that was immensely important. Now, when we talk about Rousseau, I will just briefly go through this, then we go back to Schlegel, because there's a lot more to be said about Schlegel. We talk about this basic division that will be present in our society to this day, literally, no exaggeration. And the division in question is society versus nature. You could talk about the bitter enmity of two very different people, Voltaire and Rousseau. One being the great admirer of society, but also the great critic, the incredibly cynical and ironic and satirical and sardonic, I would say, individual, such as Voltaire, but someone who firmly situates himself with the society, with all its flaws, with all its shortcomings. On the other end, we have the person who is the champion of nature, and this is, of course, Rousseau. So Rousseau thinks that everyone is born into goodness, that we are born perfect and pristine, virginally pure, and then that society basically corrodes us, it degenerates us, and it takes us away from our genuine, pristine nature. So he believes that we're all born good, but then we're turned evil, or some of us, or most of us, are turned evil by society that is inherently wrong. And of course, not to enter this discussion, there's a lot to be said for and against both of these positions. But it is one of the very important influences out of which Romanticism will grow. Now, back to Schlegel, we are talking about this idea of endless references, of recapitulation, of building the future with the past. And we are talking really about Schlegel's idea of irony. Now, this is something we've dealt a lot during my studies, and that was drilled into our collective minds. Schlegel's idea of irony. And it's something that is so incredibly influential and so incredibly important, not only in formation of Romanticism, but really history of thought, history of ideas, is this idea that will situate itself in every sequent stylistical formation that comes after Schlegel, that comes during Romanticism, and of course after it, but as we already said, there's no after Romanticism, not for the moment at least. So how does he view irony? He views irony as this particular way in which we are trying to understand the world. So there is a thing, with the capital T, if you will, if you want to be dramatic about it, and that then there's the attitude that we cannot understand the thing while we are inside the thing. So imagine yourself being inside of a sphere. You're not entirely certain about the shape of a sphere until you place yourself outside of the sphere. The only way to truly understand the shape or the qualities or of this particular, let's say, geometric body or an object or whatever, is to situate yourself outside of it. Now, this does not have to, of course, have to do with spatial bodies. It can have to do with emotions or states of mind or abstract concepts, what have you. You want to put yourself outside of the thing that you observe so that you'd be able to properly assess it and so that you'd be able to properly understand it. Now, once you've placed yourself outside this thing that you're trying to comprehend, you have removed yourself to a different plane. This is a vertical ascending train of thought, if you will. So you have placed yourself on a superior ladder, let's put it that way, so as to be able to look at the object or notion in question. But in doing so, you've gained the capacity to observe the object, which is great. But now you want to also observe your relation to that object. You want to see yourself and how you see that object. So you want, in order to fully understand this object, you have to include your perception. You have to include your own understanding of that thing. So you need to observe this as well. So you want to remove yourself on an even higher ladder. Now we can say that this was the object. This is where you started from. So this ladder would be one stage above, one ladder above, from which you observe the object. So this is one extra step of your intellectual or spiritual journey. So once from here you have seen the object, now you want to see this position. So the object and your position about the object. You want to be able to understand your understanding of the object. So then what you do is that you remove yourself on another ladder. So from this position, you observe your understanding of the object as well as the object itself. Now, of course, you can surmise what the next step is. No guessing is necessary. Once this has been done, you are in a different position, but now you want to understand this position too. So now, of course, what you do is, again, you remove yourself to an even higher ladder, so as to be able to understand this position, and so it goes. It has no end. So you constantly remove yourself out of this position that you're trying to observe, but in doing so, you gain yet another position that you want to observe and comprehend. And so it goes. Now, this, of course, all has to do with core of Romanticism. It has to do with this idea that was very important for Schiller, another sort of a philosopher, but more of a poet, and let's broadly say thinker, that you are contemplating really the division of man and nature, that this idea that we remove ourselves from nature. So we go back to this whole Rousseau and Voltaire business, that man has removed themselves, humans have removed themselves from nature, and we are still aching from this removal. We are not satisfied by it. We have lost immensely. We have lost, for all, this feeling of wholeness, this feeling of interconnectedness with the rest of existence, with the rest of life. This is something that Freud argues about in his famous essay, Civilization and its Discontents. I recommend you read it or listen to it here on YouTube. It's available in audio format. It truly is very interesting. So we speak of this division. We speak that in gaining consciousness, in gaining a capacity of abstract thought, amongst other things, we have removed ourselves from nature and we have lost this wholeness of existence that we shared with the entire planet, or if you will, the entire universe. Consciousness that we've gained is something that allows us to see the world and to understand the world, but in this understanding, we always remove ourselves from the world. And this is the curse of humanity, that in understanding, in seeking to understand, in seeking to gain knowledge, you remove yourself from the experience, immediate experience. Now, I will give a very banal, but I would say very illustrative example. I don't know if it has ever happened to you that you are, let's say, dancing in a club or whatever, and you're enjoying the music, it's great, you're enjoying your dancing, and you think, oh my God, I'm having so much fun. Now, the moment you think this, you have removed yourself from the immediate experience that is very Dionysian, if you will, or is very ecstatic, perhaps, but there's no reason involved. There's no observation. There's no thinking process involved if you're truly having fun. If you have enough senses about you to say, oh, this is great, you've already lost the moment, your reason has kicked in, and you're not in the immediate experience anymore. So it's not quite the same as just being, how should I say, not blindly, but ecstatically in the moment. And this is exactly what Schlegel argues is the experience of irony, is that in trying to understand the world really as such and its many notions and phenomena, you constantly remove yourself from the immediateness of human experience. And this is something that Schopenhauer argues in his own right. This is something that Nietzsche argues in his own right. Heidegger as well. But then also Baudrillard, then also many other thinkers. The whole of existentialism, if you will, is basically about us removing ourselves from uniqueness and immediacy of human experience. Now, people are more or less optimistic or nihilistic about this. Some of them think that we have lost this capacity to authentically live through things forever. It's forever lost. Some of them think that things can be done for us to return. Nietzsche is strangely, and I would say hilariously, perhaps the most optimistic about this. But yeah, not to get into that whole thing. So what I'm trying to argue here is that what permeates all these later eras that we've discussed is basically set up in the very beginning of Romanticism. And what is also set up in the very beginning of Romanticism in works of Schlegel are the main traits, the main lines in which this particular era develops itself. And when you're looking into Schlegel's work, when you're looking into what he studied, you clearly see that this is the core of Romanticism. You can see that he studied Orientalism. He was very much interested in India and that whole business. He studied the medieval period, which, again, very romantic, or very much in line with Romanticism. And he studied Gothic art. What more can we say about this? This is incredibly obvious. So this is something to say that this really is a very good substantiation of our initial premise that all of the different stylistical formations that we were talking about had to do with the very beginning of Romanticism as an era. Now, there's another thing that is immensely important that we want to recapitulate talking about all of these, and that is the very widespread attitude that begins, again, with Romanticism, and that popular art is increasingly more important, in fact, that it is more important than so-called high art. This, too, is a very romantic, but rather Romanticism-connected notion. Now, I want to go back to the apparition of a very famous, very influential book of poems that was made by Wordsworth and Coleridge, that was called Lyrical Ballades, and that had a very famous introduction, in which they argued that deliberately they decided not to deal with classical topics that deal with Greek myth or Greco-Roman myth. They decidedly didn't want to sing hymns to Athena or Zeus or Apollo or whichever other theme was deemed worthy of high poetry. No, they deliberately wanted to deal with what was ordinary, what was lowbrow, and what was deemed as incredibly vulgar at that moment. This idea that they would sing songs about working class people, about poor people, about widows and orphans. This was unimaginable, because up until that moment it was seen that poetry truly only speaks of highbrow, eternal truths and beauties. And of course, we've started developing this attitude that art can also be lowbrow, but in fact, that good art is almost necessarily lowbrow. We started developing this attitude that then got accepted more or less wholeheartedly, that art feeds itself off garbage. It grows in garbage heaps. Interesting attitude. Of course, this was very controversial back in the day when it appeared. And we see that this is really the beginning of this whole idea of camp and kitsch and trash, although arguably we had a lot of kitsch artists even before this. But this is where it starts being formulated. This is where it starts being explained and theoretically framed and presented as such. And of course, we can see how this has very large influence on all of the eras that are going to come later. Now, you think about Impressionism, and you think about the type of art that could not be further away from all of the things that we're talking about right now, but you also think about the fact that Impressionist paintings were very poorly done. We've addressed this already. Technically speaking, I mean, not that they were poorly done aesthetically. I find them to be amazing aesthetically, but technically they were not well made. They were not made to last. And anyone who knows anything about painting will tell you as much. The idea is that they were intentionally made that way. They were made to be ephemeral. And this is a very important thing because they were made in the industrial context where everything was hyper-produced with great speed, with great efficiency. And so they were done in a way to compete with this hyper-productive society. But they were not made with the usual care that was given to works of art, amongst other things, because Impressionist paintings were secular in nature, most of them. So it was this idea that we will not spend ungodly amount of resources and time painting incredibly important topics that deal with the very core of our existence, the very core of our culture, like, let's say, scenes from the Christian lore. No, we were painting flowers and sunsets and haystacks, and we were making these paintings very, very quickly. We've covered this already. But the whole thing is that we started making art that was popular, that was broadly available, that dealt with topics that were in themselves broadly available. The type of art that did not necessitate us to be able to read Greek or Latin, to be familiar with all of the major Greek and Roman poets. It was this idea that no, art is for the people now, truly. It's no longer business of the elites. Art belongs to everyone now, and everyone is supposed to be able to understand it. So if you think about, let's say, William Blake, an English painter, well, etcher rather, but also a painter, I guess, and a poet, you can see that a lot of his poems are, half of them are about a mythical world that he created himself, which is another interesting thing to do. But the other half are about very ordinary poor people, about chimney sweepers and orphans and things of that nature, which was not usually done in poetry up until that moment. And we can see that his paintings are very similar to that. So it's this idea that you either create a world of your own, you remove yourself from the previously existing globally shared context. Again, globally, I'm talking about the first world. But you create your own thing, you become innovative. And this is another thing that begins more or less with Romanticism, this whole idea that innovation is good. It was not seen as good before. This was a derogatory term, innovation. If you were to veer from the well-beaten path of all the ancient masters, you were doing something entirely insane. And this was lack of character. This was lack of skill on your end. No one thought this was a good idea. Well, as the script is completely flipped. Now, it's a good thing not to repeat, not to imitate. It's actually seen as advantageous for you, and it speaks of your creativity, it speaks of your ingenuity if you invent styles and ways of representing things that didn't exist before. And again, we are still in this optics. We still think that artists are to be creative, they're to invent new stuff, they're to offer something original, etc. So in this particular way, we are still in Romanticism. To this day, we share this particular idea. Now, of course, we also have this very major issue of desacralization and sacralization happening at the same time. Now, what am I talking about? Well, of course, a major part of this particular era was taking a stance on Christianity, if you will, and it has to do, of course, yet again, with the French Revolution and their idea that they wanted to cancel the church, they wanted to create a secular society, and all of it. And it has to do with us seeking new, inventive, synthetic, and syncretic forms of spirituality. Now, of course, this takes many forms, and you have pagan revival, you have Wicca, you have Aleister Crowley, very famously, Helena Blavatsky, many people in that particular line. People who are interested in new ways of creating spirituality because they don't see themselves in line with the Christian church anymore, with Catholic or Protestant, if you will, churches. You can say that the French Revolution brought this forward. Then it was repeated to a certain extent with the Bolshevik Revolution because they wanted to create the new form of spirituality. And then the Chinese Revolution as well. Now, if you think about the Bolshevik Revolution in particular, we have to address very importantly the work of Malevich that we also addressed already in this particular form, that it too is a part of Romanticism in this particular regard. Romanticism, of course, was all about revolutions. I mean, of course. And we have to mention his black square, this incredibly important artifact that he presented as an icon. He situated it in the eastern corner of the gallery. There will be an image to illustrate. And he did not seek to necessarily deny what came before the Orthodox Church in Russian context. He sought to reinvent it, and he sought to reintegrate it into the new world. So he basically presented his black square as an icon. You can argue if he represented it as a substitute for the icon or as the icon itself, just painted, presented in a drastically different aesthetic. But he did present it as an icon. He did say this is the new icon. So it's basically this idea that the Bolsheviks, the Soviets, the revolutionaries, call them what you will, the communists, they did not seek to destroy spirituality, as they are often accused. They sought to reinvent it, and they sought to reintegrate it into the new world. So this was also something to renew. This was also something that was to be inspired by the past so that we could build a new future. Now, when it comes to Malevich, of course, he wanted to completely destroy the past. He wanted to start anew, but spirituality was present in this new world, which was obviously shown to us by him installing his revolutionary work of art, presenting it as an icon. And it has to do also with the aforementioned poem, The Twelfth, written by Alexander Blok, where, major spoilers, if you didn't read it, it's an amazing poem. He sees the Bolshevik revolution, he sees the Russian revolution with all its flaws, with all its, you could argue, atrocities in the civil war and the hunger and all of the negative things that you can say, personal vendettas, revolution being used to score some personal, debts from before. He sees all of this as connected to Christianity. He sees Jesus marching in front of the revolution. This is the ultimate spoiler that you get to the very last verse of the poem as he says, yes, these guys are going, they're shooting about, there's snow and misery and hungry dogs around them, but in front of all of them walks in glory, unscathed by bullets, Jesus Christ. So it's this whole idea that there's a very strong spiritual inspiration in this whole thing, and that it deals with desacralization and sacralization at the same time. Now, I want to really briefly go, this is going to be a whirlwind overview of all of the eras, or most of the eras that we've discussed thus far, and I just briefly want to say how they're all connected to Romanticism. Now, we've done the whole Romanesque thing. We've said why we included it, why we began from Romanesque art. We've done a chapter that's Paleology and Renaissance and Romanticism. I guess this is plainly covered as it is. We talked about Gothic art and Impressionism. Of course, Gothic art was a major interest of Schlegel, and the medieval period was a major inspiration for Romanticism. So you can understand why this was done. And you can understand that this also is a very interesting visual comparison, but also thematical, that it too is a part of Romanticism as it is. Then we spoke of Renaissance and pointillism and this whole scientific approach, which of course is a major part of Romanticism because we're talking about the industrial era, we're talking about science and scientific method becoming incredibly important. I mean, the 19th century, as well as the 20th century, really is the era of science. Major scientific discoveries. Not even arguably 19th century much more than the 20th. Then we have mannerism and symbolism. Of course, symbolism is a direct branch of Romanticism, and there's many connections to be mentioned. We speak of decadence, we speak of this idea that we've passed our peak, that we've passed our zenith. Curiously enough, when Hegel writes about Romanticism, which is kind of funny because he belongs to it, so he writes about something he is actively creating and experiencing, he writes about it as about, to a certain extent, decadent period, aesthetically speaking, because he says that the classical period is aesthetically superior to Romanticism because spirit and matter are in perfect harmony in the classical period. Whereas in symbolical period, they're not. It's the matter that dominates over spirit. In classical, they're in harmony. And then in Romanticism, spirit dominates over matter. So we have, even in this manner, this past the zenith, past the peak thing going on. Then we have Baroque on one end and Fauvism on the other. We have this divine inspiration, again, with the spirit. again, with going into the depth of humanity, inspecting what humanity is all about, inspecting what organic existence is all about. Of course, again, influenced by the Industrial Revolution. We have Art Nouveau and Rococo, more decadence, more frilliness, more ornamentations. Grotesque is a major part of Romanticism, and many lectures can be made just on this topic. Then we have the beginning of another cycle in our lecture. We're talking about neoclassicism and analytical cubism. So this is the first time that we'll talk about neoclassicism not as being inspired by Romanesque art, but by inspiring analytical cubism. And of course, it too has a lot to do with Romanticism, because of course it takes place at the same time, neoclassicism, I mean. Then we continue Romanticism and Expressionism. Enough said. Then it's a list of Gothic revival and influences over different eras. So it's basically Gothic revival in data, Gothic revival in abstract art, Gothic revival in surrealism, and a lot can be said about all of this, especially when it comes to surrealism and this bizarre inspiration that it draws directly from medieval art. Then we have abstract expressionism, which I guess is the perfect example of Hegelian worldview, where spirit seeks to liberate itself from matter entirely. And you could say the same thing about action painting to a certain extent, impressionism and action painting. Then we have pointillism, divisionism, and optical art, which is further in that line of scientific inquiry and dealing with shapes and talking about perception, talking about reality of perception and that whole thing. Then we have symbolism and conceptual art, be it all about the meaning and, again, liberation of spirit, completely leaving the material aspect of art aside. We have Fauvism and colored field painting, back to the inspection of what is truly human, of feelings, of depths of human persona and human soul. Then we have Art Nouveau and consumerist art, back to popular art and the industrial period. And then, of course, we have surrealism and lowbrow art, my personal favorite. So you can see how this goes back to both popular art and medieval inspiration. And then finally, expressionism and neo-expressionism, not much explanation needed here, I guess. And abstract art and minimalism. Whoops, we have our time entirely spent. And then finally, we have analytical cubism and Harlem Renaissance. So we basically have this entire agenda, all of these eras being very much permeated by Romanticism. Of course, my alarm went off, so I really need to finish here. And yes, I hope all of this made sense. I feel like I haven't scratched the surface talking about Romanticism. It's such a wealth of info that is in this period. There's so much to be said, and I hope to return to it some other time. Thanks for your attention, and we have one more lecture to go in this series, so stay tuned. Talk to you soon. Bye.